Sid, I can't hear you anymore. I can't hear you anymore.
Me neither. Me neither.
Sid, I think you've gone on a mute.
I think you've gone on a mute.
Sid, you're on a mute. You might want to remove your mute.
You might want to remove your mute.
I think Utkarsh muted Sid.
Muted Sid. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Now.
Okay. See, all those wonderful words I said about harmony and but
That's probably the battery is falling ahead.
no. To be honest, I really mean it. I mean, you always surprise me with the kind of the stuff that you do, man. You walk to Dandi and back. You're a true Gandhian. You also teach semiotics. You're pretty amazing as a professor and somebody who's like a scholar, and what a voice you've got, and what a wonderful musician you are. I mean, it's just words fail me, and then you argue with me, so that's always a good thing. so that's harmony for you. And I've got Saurabh, who has been my junior at MICA, which is my only bragging point. The rest of it, he's soared to such heights that we can only dream of looking at him and really admiring him for where he's gone. I mean, he's just gone within the Leo Burnett group, and then over a period of time, he just grew and grew and grew. And what I found really interesting, because both of us served on a really defunct panel called the MICA Governing Council for Alumni, okay? And what happened was that what I really liked about him was, he comes across as a very sorted person in spite of the stratosphere that he's flying at. And also, secondly, he is somebody who's, I think he has been able to manage just accepting all the challenges that have come his way. So I know how difficult it is for a typical ad agency guy to actually know how to even have a conversation with, say, a Digitas or then a Sapient and talk of product and the rest of it. But he's made that transition, and he's been somebody who's played a bigger and bigger corporate role. And now he finds himself at the start of a new innings wherein he calls himself the biggest possible communication startup in India. It's a great time to start a business, Saurabh.
Perfect time.
So I'm just saying. So, well, now that I've introduced the speakers, and hopefully everybody can hear me, Utkarsh, hopefully I can be heard. But the second thing I wanted to talk about was the topic. So here's the deal, right? I just wanted to, I'm talking to two guys who are at the cutting edge or the bleeding edge of where culture meets communication. And I just wanted to get your take on it. I mean, that's the overall broad area of discussion. And I just wanted to maybe start off with a question that I can ask to the two of you, get your take on it, and then we'll move on. So the question to you is, obviously we've seen this pandemic, and we've seen Black Lives Matter, and we've seen, I mean, at various levels, we've seen just unrest and shitty things happening and the rest of it. I just wanted to understand whether we know our communication game in the culture that we are now facing, or have things suddenly like changed and we are at a different place. I just wanted to get a sense of it from two very different perspectives. I am happy. This is where I shut up and listen to you guys. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, Harmony, yours. Go for it.
Okay. So Sid, first, thank you for a very, very embarrassing and deeply glowing introduction. It's really nice to, have a forum like this, I guess, where we're talking about things as they happen. Now, my work, at least some of it, has been in history, in social history in particular, where you don't look at the obvious kind of historical archive or the source. You look for other archives. You look for, you look at newspapers and journals, and you look at women's diaries, and you look at recipe books to give you a sense of a period as it emerges. But typically, the work of a historian, as you can imagine, is always making sense of things in hindsight. Where this is different, and where I feel like the method still has something to offer us, but where this is different, of course, is that every moment that we're living through is causing massive disruptions to the ways in which we thought we were able to understand culture. We thought we were able to understand society. A lot of the structural mechanisms on view have not altered. There is still the possibility of reading this pandemic in the light of everything that we know about how class functions or how caste functions in the Indian context, how race functions in several different parts of the world. That much we get to keep. But everything else, and again, the reason that I start with this is because you mentioned Black Lives Matter and the kind of civil unrest that a lot of us have been around the world, really, in different ways and forms, been living through for a really long time. Now, my work as a historian tells me that this does not exist in isolation, that all of this is coming from somewhere. Unless you look at Jim Crow, unless you look at the civil rights movement, and way before that, unless you look at the very formation of the idea of America, the role that race has played in disenfranchising entire sections of that population are not going to make sense to people. Black Lives Matter does not exist in isolation. It comes from somewhere. And it's possible for us to be able to look at the forces that allow for something like this to kick off when it does. But that is only part of what we're talking about here, because if you're talking about something that emerges from a group of people and their communication practices in particular, that is something that we see evolve on a literally minute-to-minute basis at the moment. And there are people at the forefront. I have friends and family, as you know, my little sister is over in New York, and a ton of other family that are based out of there. And minute to minute, groups like Decolonize This Place, organize local Black Lives Matter chapters, etc., that have to constantly tweak and reframe both their entire overall design and activity, as well as the ways in which they're communicating these to their audiences, but also newer audiences on a literal moment-to-moment basis. This is changing in front of our eyes, and I don't know if we necessarily have either the ability or all the tools. And by this, I don't mean technology. I'm not talking about technology here, which is, for me, platform. But I don't know if we have the wherewithal to continually be offering up newer and newer, more dynamic, more all-encompassing analyses, mainly because these are events that have not completely unfolded. They haven't completely played themselves out. The pandemic hasn't completely played itself out, which is why for someone like me, I know it's a stupid thing to say, but a part of me hesitates to offer up an analysis simply because I don't have the full picture. I don't know what this is going to do to us. I know what it's doing to certain sections of us. I know what it's doing, the toll that it takes on different strata of society, but I don't yet have a comprehensive framework through which I can understand something like the pandemic in India, or for that matter, the kind of tensions that, we're looking at, unless, of course, deeply contextually. So I don't have a broad analysis to offer, but I would argue that this is probably a moment to remind ourselves that humility, as scholars, as analysts, as communicators, is key right now, because we don't know, and we have to be okay with that. We can't be in a rush to, talk about a new normal, because I don't know what it is. I don't know what the reshaping of the Indian mind is going to be, because this has not completely unfolded yet. And there was never such a thing as one Indian mind to start with, So, yeah, I'll stop now. And
no, it's interesting. I'm going to take take a little bit of a pause here and kind of decode it or dumb it down for people like me. I'm a moron, so I try to kind of. So what I'm understanding from you, and I'm not expecting a response from you. Maybe you can think about it, because that's the residue that's remaining behind. Is that we don't fucking know. is what you're saying. And the second thing is, I don't think we are going to be in a situation wherein we are going to know very soon. And so till the time that we actually have a very clear answer, maybe be a little humble, is what I'm getting from you. Have a think about what I've said. Saurabh, over to you.
Yeah, my sense is, change is only getting accelerated, and we have enough data points around that. No surprise there. And for sure, some behaviors will change, right? When you see categories, behaviors around those categories will fundamentally shift, right? So depending on the category, some behaviors will be more, and in other cases not that much. So if you, let's say, fundamentally take a category like let's say take a category like, let's say take auto, right?
Yeah.
You will see that in the short term there will be a whole bunch of behavior changes, right? So for example, you might find that you might not want to currently ride on an Ola or Uber simply because you're scared, right? Or you might find that you don't want your driver to coming back in the mass transit systems, and therefore you might say, listen, let me give him a two-wheeler so that he can come directly. Now that's a behavior change. Or you might find that there might be enough downgrades which might happen, right, from somebody who's considering a four-wheeler to buying a two-wheeler, right? So I think there'll be some small changes, but I personally think we are this whole concept of the new normal, we are making it out to be a lot more than it actually is. Fundamentally, my issue, with change is that systemic change comes when the source code changes, and our source code, right, is still, the same, Sid, right? It's still governed by this fundamental factor which is called growth, right? So till the time we are all, that's the defining factor, which is growth, right? Nothing really will change, right? We will maybe move from, I would say, conspicuous consumption to conscious consumption. Let's assume, right? So let's assume there'll be a flight from quantity of things that you own to quality of things that you own, right? I can see that as a shift. So, for example, you might say, let me not buy 10 pairs of shoes. Let me actually go and buy one, but a really good one, right? But the source code, right, which is what I define as what's really needed at this moment of time for us to fundamentally shift and alter what we do, that's not changing, right? So I think we will, there will be a change, but it won't be as dramatic as we thought it would be, right? And some categories will see a much bigger change, and other categories will see a much smaller change, right? And that's my sense of where behavior and therefore long-term culture will play out.
Okay, so let me just push you a little, and maybe I'll get Harmony's view on this as well. What I understand is, okay, things are not going to be that different once things are kind of stabilized with, let's say the pandemic or anything else, right? What I wanted to just explore with you is that, do you think a communications agency, which you're going to start up or have started up, requires an overhauling of its business model, or the way in which it functions, or the way in which it taps into culture? Because up till now, what we've seen is that a lot of the brands that we are talking about in reverence have begun to fall off on the wayside. Like, for example, today I saw a Nike being questioned for whatever it was doing, as compared to a Michael Jordan, who's like putting in much more money than Nike, and so Nike was being called out for whatever. And up till now, Nike was known for the work that it did with Kaepernick and the rest of it. So I'm just trying to with you whether you think, from a professional perspective, that communication agencies are actually they'll need to change.
Of course, Sid, I mean, like the whole model is broken. I mean, it's a shitty model, right? I mean, any model which is an agent-based model is going to die, right? I mean, you take any agent-based model in the world, right? In any industry, right? It is going to get challenged by a platform, right? So fundamentally, it's not just this crisis which is going to, fundamentally force a change. The change was anyway coming. I mean, the amount of fragmentation which exists in the industry, right? I mean, if you see some of the some of the real drivers in the industry, none of it is really, we are not really built for the new age, right? I mean, there's a huge amount of value we add. Don't get me wrong. I mean, 20% of any brand's intangible value is called the brand. Any company's value is called the brand, right? Strong brands recover much faster than weak brands. I mean, the kind of value we have created on one side is massive. On the second side, when you look at the pressure on the fee, I mean, I keep saying it's a paradox, a huge paradox, right, for the industry. I mean, my estimation, and is that by the end of the year, this industry will have 5,000 jobless people. Just the advertising, media, and the communication industry, right? So the model has to change. The model has to fundamentally alter. I mean, if you look at fundamentally the model, I mean, at the moment, and this is what I call about shift in behavior, right? You might, I mean, if you see just the financial model, right, Sid, I mean, 10% of your revenue is something which is called real estate, right? I'm not so sure that's relevant anymore, right? And fundamentally, you will see some behaviors which are going to get formed. It's not very far away that you will have 4-day work weeks across the world, right? It's not very far away when you will have robots paying for you staying at home, right? Those things will happen, right? But I mean, the industry was ready for an absolute disruption way back. I mean, just a bunch of glorified copywriters. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, there are some production houses which make more money than advertising agencies, right? So how do you really I mean, you have to be in the right business. I keep saying that. And that's really where everybody has to finally make a move. And I don't mean whether it's creative or media. I think the whole thing will get disrupted. Right?
Okay, all right. I'm going to come back to you. Yes, Amani?
Sid, so that was wildly interesting, but also, Saurabh, I kind of realized that at least in the initial part of what you were saying, we're not saying fundamentally different things, because I do agree with what you're saying about the shifts that we're seeing. We don't know if they're going to be fundamental. Yeah. What you're calling the source code wala situation, except that in a couple of little places. Now, again, I don't know if this is something that's going to become mainstream anytime soon, but there's a wonderful economist called Kate Raworth, and her work on donut economics is basically the blueprint on which Amsterdam is now looking to rebuild itself and everything that the city stands for coming out of a pandemic like this. And that actually speaks a little bit to what you were saying about quantity versus...
Dumb it down for me. I have no idea.
Yeah, so the donut model that she talks about has an environmental ceiling. It's literally the shape of a donut, Sid, okay? Right. So the Bahar ka layer is an environmental ceiling. More than this, it's a planetary ceiling. No more than this, the planet collapses. And under this, it's impossible for us to survive. So the sweet spot for everybody, regardless of what industry you're talking about, is going to be in that little layer that forms the donut itself. It couldn't be more straightforward if she tried, okay? And this is something that I think is going to cause a massive rethink. I know that in the Netherlands, it's not just Amsterdam, but Amsterdam specifically calls it the donut model that they're going for. But in Rotterdam, for example, there are questions about sustainability, planetarity, ceilings, etc., that are now becoming central to discourse in disciplines where earlier the paradigms were very, very different. Now, in semiotics, one of the things that we speak about in the course is, of course, the fact that you have different codes that are obviously emerging, dominant, and lapsed ones. But more than that, you have some trends which have a whole lot more staying power than others do. And I agree with Saurabh fundamentally in that this is not the first time we've witnessed a pandemic. Okay, think about exactly 1 century ago when you have the Spanish flu, and that affects India in a ginormous way. I'm not suggesting that this is the same set of situations. I'm not suggesting it's the same country. Of course, there was no India back then. But the point is that it takes a lot to cause a fundamental change in what he was. And I'm not sure that a pandemic, especially one which has at the moment no end sight. Yeah, we're not looking at an end to this anytime soon, but we're also looking to find ways to mitigate it. And when we do that, what we're rushing towards is something that needs coping mechanisms in the short term, but not necessarily causing the kind of paradigm altering shifts that would emerge from something else. I can give you examples of those in a minute. And the second thing I wanted to respond to, of course, is that, for a long time, we've been saying now that for brands in particular, social activism is the new sex, man, because that's what sells. We've said this in class a ton of times. I know it's deeply cynical to say this, but I believe it with every ounce of my being. Unless you're making the right noises in this call out culture and virtue signaling, which also is, has its own set of problems. Sure. But when you have people with voice, you're going to see people call out organizations, institutions, industries that they perceive are out to hoodwink them. Nobody wants to think that they're being bested by people who think they know better. The people who think they know us better than we know ourselves. You know what I mean? Yeah. So for a longest time we've known this, and this goes back to your Nike and Kaepernick wala situation, which I thought was really well done, by the way. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. But it is the new sex. sex is obviously problematic for a bunch of reasons now, because we're finally in a place where we're talking about the gross objectification of bodies and so on and so forth. This is all old hat. So what are you going to do now? Now you're going to have to come across as a heck of a lot more societally aware and driven than you've ever had to be in the past.
Let me just ask Saurabh this question. Do you think that this whole damn way in which we have to advertise, okay? Why the fuck do we have to advertise, man? Can't marketers actually find a different way of manipulating minds?
No, I you have to understand, that some of the global models, don't apply to India at all. I mean, it's really a shocker, right? I mean, I was a huge proponent of, creating purpose brands. And of course, for me, the definition of a purpose brand is very different than the way India thinks about it.
Right.
India, you have, this, let's say, what I call the Mickey Mouses of, our society, right? The top 1% who are very opinionated, right?
Yeah.
But the rest of India who, who's very functional, right? They're very functional. I mean, you take in India, right? I keep telling every client, you just try and appropriate a big category driver, right? And don't try and create massive layers around your communication. You take a brand like Limca, right? I'm just giving you an example, right, of how functional India is, right? And I think we've got to separate. We've got to understand where India really is, because when you see these global examples, you start feeling maybe that's what India is, and India's not that. If you move Limca from thirst to refreshment, it fails, right? You start to take it back to thirst, and that's where it starts to work, right? When you launch an Amazon in the country, you can't launch it on the back of some really higher order benefit. You'll launch it on the back of choice, right? I've got 5 crore products for you to choose from, or dikhao, right? So I think we've got to understand that, yes, Asian Paints, does something good, right, in India by saying, listen, I'm actually going to give people not just cut salaries. In these, really troubled times, I'll go ahead and I will actually take care of my stuff. And you will still be put under the gun by that 1%. Now, of course, you must have a strategy to manage that 1%, right? Because, guess what? If you don't do that, right, you will have a huge amount, right? But I don't think brands in India get made at that level. Brands don't get made on Twitter, right? I mean, let's be clear. So, I think, we assume that let's say the top 20%, 20,000 people will actually dictate the fortunes of a brand. And that's not true at all, right? In India, still, it's very simple. You still need some very simple communication. I mean, you look at, how Modi has managed his brand, right? And, some of the best communication I have seen has been created politically, right? And it's very simple messaging which is, collective, individual, participation, collective impact, right? Very, very simple stuff. You participate, do something very quickly, and you can see the whole of country. You can hear the noise coming from every balcony, right?
Yeah.
It's very,
it is. Look, my feeling is that you're giving a great example, which can be polarizing politically. But what I wanted to figure out from you is that, do you think, okay, so I'm getting 2 things, and I know that you've studied myths and archetypes, and I'm going to get to your harmony, so just hang on to your hat for a minute. I'm just trying to understand, from your perspective, do you see India as more transactional, the Amazon example that you gave, or do you see India as a country that is driven by myths and archetypes?
No, I think that's the problem, because it's not one or the either. It's not either or, right? It's and. What I'm trying to say, you need a narrative, you need a story, right?
Yeah.
But I think our problem is we start thinking that brands get built on Twitter, and that's what I'm really calling out. I'm really saying that mass of India loves a very simple message, right? And I'm not saying that it has to be functional, right? Because that even that functional message can be done in a very emotional manner, right?
Sure.
But it has to be so simple that I know what, right?
Yeah.
And I think there is not one India. There are so many Indias that we are playing for, and there are so many segments that we are playing for right at the moment, right? And understanding of all of them, takes a hell of a lot of effort. Then I would say paintbrushing all of them as a single audience. Right?
Okay, so let me just ask how many, right? She teaches a subject called Imagining India. So,
Okay.
and I'm sure she's probably in broad agreement with you in terms of the fact that there are many Indias and stuff like that. So I want to ask you a different question, Harmony. You talked of the broken activism thing. Okay. Now what I'm hearing from Saurabh was about Twitter activism too. Right. So in my head, I was processing it as, okay, Twitter activism actually doesn't work, even though we are all active on bloody Twitter, and we are active on the rest of not you, people who So what do you think? Where do you think the communication around activism is broken? Do you think it's broken? Do you think where do you think it can be improved, if anything? Because we can look at it as a project or a case study, and you can say, okay, I objectively think this can be done differently. Like I asked him about agencies, maybe.
I hear you. No, that's a really interesting kind of way to think about it. Of course, I don't think Saurabh was talking about activism. He was talking more about.
No, he wasn't.
He said brands aren't built on Twitter. I mean, I would have to agree with that, and I would defer to what he has to say about brands entirely. But I will say that political brands are largely built on social media platforms, and have been at least for the last decade odd. Like that. That is pretty clear to me. That's a huge part of the strategy. Also, I'm always dubious, of course, of things that work at the level of an empty signifier. Okay, something to flesh it out, and it's leading somewhere. That communication is downright misleading, if not mischievous. But that aside, I'll kind of get to what you're saying. And I don't use Twitter, and I've mindfully stayed away from it all these years. I've never been on it, simply because I know that it will be far too overwhelming. I understand it's a really polarized space, but I don't know enough about the platform, not being on it, to comment on it. But I will talk about social media activism in general. I think, like with everything, it can be really useful as a tool for organizing. And remember that when we're talking about educating, agitating, and organizing is a huge part of this, right? And I think anybody from what they call the Arab Spring, what different groups call the Jasmine Revolution, call it what you will, but from that moment on, it's impossible to deny the power of technology, of mediums like this, and technology to drive, just really important things like where to assemble and at what time. And I thought we got a little glimpse of that again with the anti-CA NRC protests when, for example, Shaheen Bagh, the reason that Shaheen Bagh became the symbol that it was able to become, and it wasn't just an empty signifier, was in large part, at least for a huge number of people, and having been to the site and having seen the people who were actually running their social media presence and pages and what they had in mind, I think it became, what they did was they populated that signifier really intelligently. They knew what they wanted people to take away from any engagement with a Shaheen Bagh official post or handle. And then what I thought was really well done, for example, is that a bunch of people, a bunch of organizations, in fact, that came together during that time saw very quickly, because the anti-CA NRC thing bled into the beginnings of the pandemic so organically. A lot of them immediately kind of repurposed, reoriented, and started, because they already had that base. You already had the tens of thousands of people that you were speaking to, and you had this direct line of communication open with them. They very quickly started getting into relief efforts, and new organizations came up literally overnight that were able to work with very specific groups. Now, I can think of, several examples in this space, but I thought that happened really organically. And I have a feeling that things that the same ephemeral, nature of stuff that stays online also allows us to quickly change and kind of adapt to new needs, kind of adapt to, today I'm giving you information about this, but tomorrow, because ye karna hai, I can also maybe leverage my channels and kind of make that happen. And I thought that was really interesting. So again, maybe as a bit of an insider, but also a bit of an outsider, it looks to me like there is a place for these things. If that's where it ends, if all that you do is social media armchair, kind of pontificating, then that's not going to, that amounts for me to less than nothing, to absolutely nothing. But remember, again, educate, agitate, organize. I can also use these platforms to educate. The agitation is on my own time, and then I can use these again to organize. So again, I'm a fan. Give me a new platform, and we will see what we can do with it.
Okay, so here's a question that I have for the two of you. It's going to be completely different. Now, one of the things that I saw was how we were terrible about communicating about this pandemic. We're terrible at it, in the sense like there was a misinformation virus and there was the actual virus that was happening, and we were like WhatsApp forward uncles, all of us, right? So that was happening, right? Now, what I'm trying to understand is, suppose Saurabh, your agency, and suppose Harmony, you as an independent agent, a communication agent who understands semiotics and in the rest of it, if you had to use hindsight just to do better communication about the coronavirus, what would you have done? What would you have done differently? I think Modi did, by the way, Modi did his bit and all of that, and it was interesting, I would say. What would you do better?
No, I think if you really look at, what he did, he didn't really speak the fundamentals around what needed to be done. I mean, when you really look at Trump and, for whatever it is worth, you give him the fact that he shows up every day with something, right? Some news or the other around the virus, right? So I think the problem is that, when you don't have an organizing authority who can shed light on what really is happening, right? And your entire narrative becomes about, let's assume, to create a sense of positivity and optimism in society. Then you leave so much room for interpretation and gimmickry, right? And I think if you ask me, what I would have done was very quickly codify a persona who would be the dominant persona for spreading all news very early in the cycle. And it could be Modi, it could be somebody else, right? But that daily update on what really needs to happen, right, has never happened through a formal channel. And I think that's part of the problem. And when that formal channel does not exist, guess what? A lot of the informal channels come into play, right? And some of those informal channels will then become or WhatsApp activists, so on and so forth. And that's what's really played out. So if you ask me, what would I have done differently? The one thing I would have actually, Arogya Setu, where you've created an app, but where is information, right? Where is the one single piece of information around what really is happening? I don't know whether you've seen all these med reports which come out in different states. And, again, there is an absolute lack of consistency, right, in terms of what you are supposed to do, how you're supposed to manage, right? So many different, pieces of information, but there is no one central place where you can go to see what's happening, right?
Okay.
So I think, that the only way to replace, I would say cacophony is to create sense of it all in a much more organized and qualified manner. Right, and if you don't do that, then you leave enough news room for noise, right?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, but do you think it was an execution problem? Before I get to Harmony, do you think it was an execution problem because of the state and the centers being at loggerheads with each other, or do you think it was just terribly thought through strategy?
No, I think it's the problem of imagination and creativity.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So the creativity is directed towards, I need to just unite everybody, and and that's where it ends. But I think but creativity needs to be in the execution. Creativity needs to be in the detailing, right? And that's where the magic happens. I keep saying that I wouldn't give a fig to this side of simplicity. It's a beautiful quote, but I would give my life to simplicity, the other side of complexity, right? So what you needed was simplicity at the other side of complexity, and that has really not happened, right?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Harmony, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, man, Saurabh, you're clearly a really good person, because also it strikes me that like you're giving a lot of the benefit of doubt to what has been the strategy, for better or worse, of communicating, of the nation communicating to its citizens in and through, something that most of us haven't the foggiest idea, because this is the first time we're all living through it. Now, Sid, before I kind of get to answering what I might have done differently and so on and so forth,
Sure.
I would argue, pressed to do so, that this is precisely the point of any kind of authoritarian regime, that you will not tolerate the kind of thing that Saurabh was talking about with a central node or somebody that I can turn to for just legitimate everyday updates and information about what the actual state of the nation is. I'll give you an example about why I'm saying this. In Gujarat, and I'm only speaking about, I've been in lockdown, I've been stuck here since March, and I've been following this every single day. We had in the city of Ahmedabad a very, very, how shall I put this, enthusiastic AMC head called Vijay Nehra. And under him, there was a lot that kind of went down in terms of testing being amply ramped up, in terms of, he was doing a lot of stuff. He was quickly shunted out and posted to Ahmedabad rural. And it was informal chat in Gandhinagar, etc., has it that they thought that he was becoming a bit of an authority unto himself. There is a health secretary here called Jayanti Ravi, who was supposed to be our one point of contact, who was giving us daily updates. Pretty soon, they realized that they didn't want any one person getting this much of contact time. They didn't want us to be able to have, again, I don't want to cast aspersions because these are things that one hears from, different kinds of channels, and political gossip is just that. It's just political gossip. But the idea in Ahmedabad, at least, was that they were uncomfortable with people who were propping themselves up as singular authorities. And in any kind of centralized, what I will not hesitate from calling authoritarian regime, you don't want people to stick out because you want there to be just that one kind of ring that rules them all and, in the darkness binds them. And if you have anybody else who actually comes up at the local level, at a state level, as an alternative, which is a genuine voice that you think you can turn to, especially in, a time like this, which is fraught with so much dissonance anyway, I don't think that sits comfortably with any kind of authoritarian regime.
Okay, but given that we are where we are, what do you do?
Yeah. What I would have, now I'm getting to that. What would I do differently? I would actually prop up tiny local nodes, just little immediate things that I can turn to. If I'm in Ahmedabad, I want the AMC to have a fucking bulletin. But to have a bulletin that goes out every day. That kind of tells me about the cases in the city. I want to know about micro containment zones. I want to know about stuff like this. And I have to say the AMC has been pretty proactive about it. But I think the answer is not in centralizing. I think the answer is in localizing. Because this is far too big. Remember, we started by saying 1.34 billion people, man. That's 20% of the Earth's population. You're not going to be able to give us, and you maybe as a center, you may be able to give me a broad picture view of the state of the nation. But ultimately, in times of a pandemic and a lockdown, what I give much more of a fuck about is my immediate surroundings. I need to know what's happening here, just like you need to know what's happening in Pune, or somebody else needs to know what's happening in even within that, just honestly decentralizing. I would have actually gone the other way and aided the decentralizing of these messages and made it so that I had authoritative versions of what's actually going down. Maybe they have these AMA, the medical association task forces, right? For different cities and so on and so forth. Maybe one of them is my point person. Instead of a politician, I would feel so much better about a medical practitioner being that point of contact for me, and not an ICMR head who has like hundreds of districts to look at. I want someone who knows about me. I want somebody around me. I might have gone down that route. And I understand that it is possible to, at some point collate that at a state level. And every state is then reporting to us. And we're a union of many different imaginations, of several different polities, of several different states.
Sure.
At what point does this federal structure actually begin to make sense? When the states are speaking to the center, when the center is speaking to the states, when there is none of this bullshit about, what had me and why I get really worked up about this is because everybody kept passing the fucking blame when it came to organizing the fares for the Shramik trains, for the specials, for the tens of thousands of people who suddenly, and the states are saying, no, those guys, the railway authority is going to bear the cost of it. The railway authority is saying, no, the state is meant to pay us 80% of this fare. Like, there was just nothing. We knew nothing. And as a civil society that is in lockdown, most of us can't go places and do shit. Who do I turn to? I was having an interesting chat with somebody the other day who just said, wouldn't it be great if we could have worked out some kind of a digital platform where those of us who can maybe, sponsor the fares of, like, I don't know, I'll pay for 1,000 people train tickets to go back home, etc. And then we realized, but Sala, uske liye, no, it would be useful if the district spoke to the state, which spoke to the center, because ye hamare bas mein hai hi nahi. And honestly, I don't know if I've ever felt more powerless as a citizen. And now I'm speaking as a citizen, not just as anything else. But that is what happens when you centralize things to the point where all kinds of local agency is just default.
That's interesting. Yes. It's interesting though. Thanks for the rant. I love your rants, by the way. They're quite refreshing, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot. So the fact is that I am actually seeing a parallel between see, I don't think what this pandemic is showing to me is that as human beings we really struggle with communication because of systemic issues. I was just wondering, whether even brands have understood it, or whether agencies have understood it, or countries have understood it. I think we're all bloody struggling. Yeah. And it's not just India that's struggling. I think a lot of countries are struggling, to be honest. Now, I've begun to get a lot of questions for the two of you on my WhatsApp based on this bullshit that we're talking about. So first is to Saurabh. All the brands have talked about stuff like togetherness. How do you think that something like this it can change the course in coming days? Do you think it's relevant enough, or do you think it's okay? So basically, how does a brand stop being hokey? I'm just translating, right?
What, do something significant, right? I mean, that's what we call acts. I mean, an empty message has no meaning. I mean, I don't know. It's just I mean, you to just see, does it really make a significant difference in the lives of human beings? And if it doesn't, it's just it's just noise. And that's what it is. And there is so much you can do in today's day and age to really make a difference on the ground, right?
Right. But what would you advise a client that please don't do this? Please do something else. What would you really advise a client? I'm just going to as somebody who's like, and you're in a vulnerable situation. You're a startup, so you want to make your mark. Your clients have certain fixed ideas because of the way in which they're actually understanding communication. You're in an unenviable situation wherein you have to deal with this shit, right?
No, I honestly said, I think there is so much to do, right? From whether you're a startup or an established player, there is just so much you can do in today's day and age. And I'm talking about fundamentally, I mean, when you really see, how communication works, right? It works when it's real, when it's really truly honest, and it does something good for people, right? Empty messages have no meaning. I'm saying, for you to say, listen, I want people to come together, right? Separate to come together. I don't know what it means. I mean, it's just bullshit, right? I mean, we've had spatial separation forever. It existed in the urinals in the men's loo, right?
Correct.
So I'm sorry, but
no, that's fine.
So I mean, take a category. I mean, today, if you were, you are an insurance company, right?
Yeah.
Why would you not take care of the so many different people who are surrounded by you, right?
Yeah.
You could create today a mate, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as an insurance company, you might say, hey, listen, why don't I, create today a job insurance product, which does not exist in India, by the way, right?
Sure.
And that to me is what I would do as a startup, which is to go and tell my clients, listen, here is an idea and how you might want to, create this. Now go down to the IRDA and actually create a product like that, and then I would create communication around it. For me to have, just create noise and say, listen, come together, right? These times, come together to do what?
Well, you can't do many things, but anyways. So look, okay. So let's bring this back to a slightly broader, beyond political analysis and commentary thing. Let's bring this back to a slightly broader question. I want to ask both of you this question, and I'll start with Harmony. Listen, Harmony, you have had a time wherein you've said, "Oh, damn, what an insight! Yeah, what an insight from a communications perspective." Okay, now that may have happened. Has it happened to you during this strange time that we're living in? Because it is one of the strangest times. So the fact that you haven't had an insight is also an insight, right? So, and I'd like to ask Saurabh the same question. Like, yeah, go on.
Sid, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I'm just munching away happily during this.
Go
I've
for it.
started doing that, by the way. Like I think I'm going to continue eating in classrooms now. The work from home situation is just treating me really well. So, two things. One,
Yeah.
I don't think an insight is something that you stumble upon. I think an insight is something that you construct.
Wonderful.
I think that therefore, to go back to what I started with saying, I don't want to put undue pressure on myself and say कि अभी no इसको understand अभी इसमें से कुछ ढूंढ and कुछ निकाल and कुछ बना. I don't have all the pictures in front of me yet. I don't have all the pieces yet, and perhaps it's not an insight at all. It's just a half-baked idea, but something that has been weighing on my mind quite heavily, and it's something that I think is going to stay with me for some time. It's just this: that it's okay to not know. It's okay to not have a glib analysis to offer up, the moment that somebody asks, and just admit, as I started by saying, with a lot of humility, कि भाई ये मेरी बस की बात नहीं है, and I don't think किसी की बस की बात है अभी के अभी. I can't give you anything definitive right now. I can see the beginnings of a lot of little things, but it would foolhardy of me to presume that I can understand them.
Give one example, no?
One example. Like I've got my eye
Which you think is
very closely.
it's a green shoot,
Yeah,
but I
so
want to know. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll give you a space that I've been observing really closely.
Sure.
Okay, which is that I came across a report just a few days ago by a very interesting economist who basically said that up to 30%. 30% of people who have managed to make their way back into so-called rural, India, back to their homes, etc., are very clear that they do not want to return to urban scapes and to cities. Up to 30% of them at the moment are saying that they don't want to come back. Now, you and I know that there is nothing in the village imagination as it stands today that is going to be there for them to do. They wouldn't have left in the first place otherwise. Okay, so I think that a place to look at and to think about is how can we reimagine these categories of rural and urban? What is the rural going to become when somebody who is soaked in the ethos of the so-called urban has gone back to it? There were always circularities. Okay? But I feel like if people are making that shift back and that's where they're headed, I'm really curious to see the shape of things that's going to come and what's going to happen in these places now. And I'm now thinking about the walk and I'm thinking about the things that I saw all through Gujarat, the month that, man. And I'm wondering what that changes now when people will have come back there. And I'm wondering what that will do to the nature of those places. So that's something I'm keeping my eyes on. I don't have anything more than that to offer you.
Okay. Saurabh?
Yeah, I mean, my background said, I used to run strategy for Burnett across 16 countries, and then, Leo Burnett, and then, across all my creative agencies, Saatchi, Publicis, Leo Burnett, we banned the word insight, right? The word insight is a tyranny, right? Because, often facts, observations are couched as insights. I mean, insight is something which is retrospectively self-evident, right? And I think it just puts undue pressure on the problem that you're trying to solve. I mean, I think as communication specialists, my biggest endeavor with the teams have always been to become more a problem hunter rather than a solution provider. Because if I can actually define a big problem, the solution will exist in the problem definition, right? So I think if you really look at it, you just can see so many problems which exist today, right? And then you take the problem, you combine it with a category, and you have something very interesting to play with, right? So I'm thinking, let's assume you're an Ola and Uber today. I mean, your big problem is of hygiene. And when I come back, right, even when I get a chance to open up, people are not going to be clear about whether I'm hygienic, How do I know that the driver who's driving me does not have COVID, right? How do you solve that as an equation, right? No, that's a problem definition. Now, I mean, to the moment you start defining the problem, I mean, all of us are at home, and guess what? We are not feeling like winners, right? At the moment, right? All of us sitting at home. Now, that's a bloody problem, right?
Yes.
What do you do with that? So I'm thinking, there are hundreds of things around us, and I think the question becomes, what can you do to solve for the problem, and is it really relevant? Is the problem relevant to your category, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's how I have seen.
So what I'm understanding from you, sorry, it's a really interesting point. What you're saying is that there's no such thing as an insight. It's just reverse logic back on something that you've seen and kind of, that's.
No, I'm not saying that. Just
okay. So what are you?
It's just the way I never said that platforms are not powerful, right? I just said that our belief that the top 100 people will actually make a difference by having a perspective on Twitter. So to me, the platforms are very powerful. I mean, when you see a WhatsApp and you see 500 million people on WhatsApp, it's very powerful, right?
Correct.
Similarly, I'm not saying that, I'm just saying when you start chasing an insight.
Got it.
When you start chasing an insight, guess what? You don't get to one. Right? That's the problem, right? So I'm not saying that insight is not relevant. What I'm saying is that you can't start by saying, so none of my creative briefs in the last, 10 years has the word insight in it. None.
Wonderful.
Right? Yeah. We removed it completely because the word insight is actually tyranny. It's just a absolute waste of a chase. It's actually sometimes cleverly constructed words for it to make, I keep saying, there are three kinds of strategists. There is the simple to simple, which means you start with bullshit and you end with bullshit. Nothing happens, right? There was, what I call the Indian school of planning, which was a complex to the complex. You start with the complexity and you leave it at something which is so complex, right? That, you take almost joy in the fact that your creative partner can't understand what you're saying. And then there is a third, which is where the magic is, where you start with the complexity and you leave it at the simplicity where the magic starts to happen. You do all your diagnosis, figure out what fundamentally is the problem you're trying to resolve, right? Try and hunt for a big problem, and guess what? You will actually have a very interesting space to play with, right? I mean, we can speak about it. This is a long conversation, and we can have hundreds of examples around finding the big problem.
Why don't you give me one example? Give one example. Yeah.
So, for example, we had a very big brand called Hewlett Packard, right? Which came to us and said, listen, I want to do exactly what we do right now, which is greenwashing, right? I have this $50,000 and, I want to do a greenwashing campaign. Can you do something in my office? Right?
Okay.
And we said, what do you have to do with something to do with office? You are a computer brand. You make, laptops, right? So what's the problem you're going to solve for, right?
Yeah.
And guess what? I mean, their big problem is actually a very interesting problem. 7 out of 10 people don't switch off computers when they leave home, right? They shut their laptops and they go, right? The environmental impact of that is massive, right? Now you have, let's say 1.5 billion laptops or computers on the planet, and 700 million of them don't get switched off on a daily basis. That's the problem to solve. So can I get people to help each other, switch off the laptop before they leave, right?
Yeah.
For me, the definition of the problem is where the magic is in. Once I've defined the problem, the solution is inherent in the problem.
Correct. You don't have to think beyond. Actually, the solution is embedded in the problem. Is what you're saying.
And I mean, we can talk about hundreds of examples like this. And my sense is find the big problem. If you find the big problem, you will find the big solution.
Interesting. Very interesting. Go for it.
Sid, I just want to add to that. Love it. Love everything that you've just said. And part of the way in which you're able to see the big problem to start with is if you're able to have plural perspectives on where you are, the society we inhabit, the cultural groups that, have their very, very definite kind of ways of making sense of the world around them. And until all of that is obvious to you, you're not going to be able to arrive at what Saurabh was calling, the big problem. And asking those questions and just asking better questions every single time. That's kind of at the heart of any of this. And I love it because even with any of the courses that we have, that we have in our area at least, we start by explaining that our starting point is ask more interesting questions. Honestly, the rest of it will follow or not. I'm not saying it always does, but if you ask a good enough question, that is much, much more kind of useful, really, than proposing any garbage.
We are reaching the end, so I had promised a googly to both of you. So here's the googly, right? So we have a problem in academia not connected to industry really well, right? So if I had to kind of state that as an interesting problem, what would your solution be to Harmony if she asks you that question? And Harmony, if I have to say that, okay, you think that agencies are being really straight-jacketed in the way in which they're approaching communication and the rest of it, what's the one thing that you would advise a business leader like Saurabh that, hey, you're just not seeing this, okay? Not him specifically or not him, yeah. So what would that be? So any one of us. So you got to. I just want you to just exchange this and go over to the other side.
To me, the solution is inherent in the problem. Who owns the academia, right? So I'm saying if you basically today say 0.5% of MICA is owned by Asian Paints and 0.5% by Microsoft and 0.5% by somebody else, guess what? You would solve the problem, right? I'm just saying, maybe the whole. If you're saying the problem is there is no connect, then create the connect, right? I mean, it's not difficult today. I mean, the amount of the huge, big budget CSR budgets that everybody's sitting on, why are they not coming your way, right? They should be going to academia.
Right. So what I'm understanding from you is get academia to be connected to industry by actually getting industry to invest in academia.
I think, what does industry want? Industry want ownership, control, right, and a clever use of their own capital, right? So I mean, you move the capital towards where it's needed to be, where it needs to go, right?
Yeah. Okay.
I know many people would have a very Puritan perspective to
100%.
Right? But if you really solve the problem, then solve the problem.
No, that's true. No, well taken. Point taken. It was your six to hit. So
this is my 5-second answer to you.
Okay. We don't have too many 5-second answers, right? On this one. Yeah. Okay. How many?
The opposite of what Saurabh just said.
And never the same answer. Okay.
No, simply because, look, I've always been of the opinion that I think it's great that as MICA, we learn so much from, partnering with so many of you that have, kind of gone out of here and done so much in the industry and so on and so forth. But if you tell me that we exist only to provide solutions to industry, then I'm sorry, man. Like, I have to remind everybody that we're an institution of higher learning. We're not a finishing school for 2 years where people will come and then be placed somewhere on the other side of it. We are an institute of higher learning that is engaged in a master's level program. And I'm afraid academic rigor is something that is sometimes at odds with, if we were trying to design exclusively, if we're trying to design exclusively for industry once, more often than not, you're not going to have the kind of attention to society, to planet, to other things that ought to be informing these discussions. All of that's going to go out the window. I don't think the answer is more industry I definitely don't think a stake for the industry in the institution would be my choice or my answer to this. What I would definitely be very comfortable with and advocate is that I think it ought to go both ways. I think that we ought to have more people from the industry actually come in and kind of go through stuff on campus, engage with campus in its multiple capacities. And similarly, I think that it would be lovely if we could get out there and see what it is that you guys actually do, in this big bad kind of corporate space that we keep talking about. I think it would be lovely to bring them closer, but I think it needs to be a two-way street.
How many you didn't answer your own question, yeah? You started arguing with him.
What, yeah? What only? What? I didn't answer my own question. Tell me what I didn't answer.
Your question was, what would you advise him for communication agencies?
Oh, sorry. Well, then, okay. A part of the answer would be, like, I think it would be really cool if we... आपके आपके पास आएंगे, आप हमारे पास आइए, because I think we've got loads to learn from each other, but I don't think that it needs to be the one dictating the terms to the other, because there's a heck of a lot that's going on in the social sciences.
Saurabh, I don't think he said that, but okay.
No, I know he didn't. I'm just at this point. He didn't say that at all. I wasn't implying that he did. I'm just saying that academia. I think we would profit. All of us would profit from remembering that even business, no matter what you're talking about, management se leke sab kuch. These are social sciences. What are we talking about? We're talking about people. Shorn of that context, nothing that you do will make sense. So just the same way that we constantly talk about, theory and praxis as if they were two different things, I'm saying that you have no praxis without theory, and the theory does not make sense without praxis, which is why industry and academia, we need to speak to each other more, but we definitely can't be just the one kind of, dictating terms to the other, though that is not what you were.
No, that's why Yogi Berra rocks, man. He says in theory and practice, in theory practice is different, etc. Something like that, no? Some bullshit like that. In practice,
I'm saying that whoever that is wrong. Okay,
all
right.
See, Harmony had promised you that by the end of this hour, we're going to end up fighting, and we're close.
But this isn't fighting. This is fun. I enjoy this. This is you and me walking around campus. It is what it is.
100%. Well, guys, 6-1. So we've already gone past a minute. Thank you so much, audience, for listening to us just bullshit our way through this hour. Thank you, Saurabh, but honestly, thank you so much. If I've goaded you into any wrongdoings or wrong conversations, or my fault, okay, I apologize to both of you. But
everything.
It was, yeah, exactly. Thank you. I thank both of you. It was a lot of fun, and I think a part 2 is required at some point in time. Thank you, Saurabh. All the very best to you. And Harmony, I hope to see you on campus soon. Yeah. All right. Cheers.
Really soon.
Cheers.
Bye. Cheers. Bye.